Slow Burn Media, an evergreen podcast, presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless. Previously on the Colonial Parkway Murders, Part 1.
3 days later, on Sunday evening, that car, a Honda Civic, was found off the Colonial Parkway. It had been rolled into these bushes, almost into the water.
Rebecca Andowski and Cathy Thomas, two haunting names never forgotten by people in Hampton Roads.
They're the first two victims of the Colonial Parkway murders.
Me and one of the other detectives found David about 50 feet down, I guess.
She had a beautiful smile and a loving way.
I won't ever stop. This is very important to me and to my family. Typically what the FBI will do is the investigative agent will text me and say, can you please call me? And I'll know they have some news. And we're talking a lot these days, and I'm thrilled about that.
He doesn't leave his truck unlocked.
Yeah, so September 20th, 1987, it's almost a year. David Nobling, who's 20, and Robin Edwards, who's 14, they're found shot to death about close to 30 miles, 25 miles away, at a place called the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge. This is on the James River. Cathy and Becky were found on the York River. David Nobling's pickup truck is found at a parking area at the Wildlife Refuge. The bodies are found 3 days later in the water, sadly by David Nobling's father, Carl, and investigators who were searching the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed Amy Mihalovic. I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a podcast that takes a deep dive into cases you may not have heard of and others that you may have. This week's case is part 2 of the Colonial Parkway Murders. I am joined again this week by Bill Thomas, the brother of Cathy Thomas, one of the first victims in the Colonial Parkway serial killings. Bill is very open and knowledgeable about the case. As a brother of one of the victims, he is honest about the feelings that he has about the investigation and how things could be handled. And just a quick refresher, the Colonial Parkway Murders were a string of serial killings that occurred in just a 3-year span from 1986 to 1989 and remain unsolved to this day. This is a case with many ups and downs, suspects galore, and coincidences that just cannot be explained. So join me and Bill Thomas this week for part 2 of the Colonial Parkway Murders. Thank you again for joining me this week. I am going to resume my conversation with Bill Thomas about the second couple that was discovered in the Colonial Parkway Murders that occurred between 1986 and 1989. So, Bill, what was the second couple that was discovered in the Colonial Parkway serial killings?
They discover Robin and David's bodies. It appears they'd been in the water for the 3 days since they had gone missing. Both of them had been shot to death. They think that David may have struggled or broken away because he's shot in the shoulder and then finished off with a kill shot to the head. Forgive me for being graphic. And Robin is also shot in the head. And it appears that David and Robin had met that night and had gone out with a cousin and other friends to the movies and an arcade. And on the way home from the evening out, David and Robin, who did not know each other very well and had just met, it was kind of drizzling, and so some of the guys were in the back of the pickup truck where it was drizzly and wet, but Robin was inside the cabin of the truck. So it appears that as they drove home in David's pickup truck, it appears that David and Robin made plans to meet up later. So David went home with his brother and dropped off the other kids. And then it appears that Robin snuck out of the house, which she'd done many times before. And they had obviously made plans to meet up. And they end up across the river at this Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, which is, again, like the Colonial Parkway, is a place where people are known to go parking. It's also a place where people are known to do like low-level drug deals, like score some pot, that kind of thing. And it's interesting. We describe these people as couples, but you'll start to see a pattern emerge here. The truth is, the only serious couple of the four is actually Cathy and Becky, the lesbian couple,
right.
My sister and her girlfriend. The others are really almost like, traveling companions, or it's a one-night stand kind of thing. I'm not passing judgment. I'm just saying we say couples a lot, but they weren't like serious couples. They were people who were together for that evening. Now, that case, by the way, is a Virginia State Police case because it happens off the Colonial Parkway, and is actually in a county called Isle of Wight County. But Isle of Wight County's sheriff's department at that point is so small and has such limited resources that they don't really investigate murders. So they ask the Virginia State Police to step in and handle the case from an investigative perspective. So the first case, Cathy and Becky, is FBI. The second case, almost a year later, is a Virginia State Police case. And at this point, no one's connecting the first murder and the second murder. These are viewed as independent events.
So the two cases they considered, they don't. So basically, what you're saying, what are you referring to? Is they're only saying that are they not?
There's little or no. They're not connecting them, and there's little or no coordination between the FBI and the Virginia State Police and the Isle of Wight Sheriff's Department. It's not until the next.
I was going to say, did they were not even aware of your sister's crime?
I can't say for sure, but I know the level of coordination and information sharing was not high. And at my understanding from media people and investigators is no one made the connection at that point. It's not until the following April, now we're up to April 10th, 1988, two young people go missing and they've never been found. So we assume that they've been murdered. This is Cassandra Haley, who's 18 years old, and Richard Keith Call. He goes by Keith because his dad is Richard, who's 20, are college students at Christopher Newport University in Newport News. They are reported missing after going to a party and missing curfew. He was supposed to have her back by, I think it's 2:00 in the morning, which kind of makes me laugh because when I think about myself as a younger man trying to get a girlfriend home in time for, so her parents weren't too upset with us.
Right.
Keith Call is driving a rust red 1982 Toyota Celica, and the car is found on the York River on the Colonial Parkway. Now we're back to the Colonial Parkway. The car is found abandoned along another one of these little pull-offs along the York River. It's just a couple of miles away from where Cathy's car had been found a year and a half prior. And it's a very similar kind of little half-moon grassy pull-off next to the Colonial Parkway. The car is very obvious. You can see the car from the road. And as a matter of fact, Keith's father, Richard Call, actually saw the car the next morning. He was a foreman at the Bush Brewery, and he's on his way to work the following morning. He actually pulled over and stopped. And when he saw Keith's car there with the door partially open, and his recollection is that he got out of the car and looked in their vehicle, the Toyota, and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But they're not there. And there's some articles of clothing inside the vehicle, and one of Sandy's boots, shoes. It was the 80s. Is found in the car. But oddly, when Mr. Call stops by the Toyota at the pull-off, he looks inside the car, and his recollection is that he didn't see those articles of clothing in the back seat and the shoe and so on. And so there's this odd inconsistency between what Mr. Call recalled seeing and what law enforcement later claim is inside the car. As a matter of fact, Mr. Call was troubled by this for the rest of his life. He died quite young, as did his wife. They were terribly troubled by what had happened to Keith. And the FBI is the lead agency again, because now we're back on the Colonial Parkway. So we've gone first case FBI, second case Virginia State Police and Isle of Wight Sheriff's Department. Third case, now we're back to FBI and National Park Service Rangers. And they begin exploring an idea, which seems ludicrous in retrospect, that Keith and Cassandra had gone skinny dipping. This makes very little sense to any of the families. This is early April. Water temperatures are in the 40s. The car is found at a place that's kind of high above the river, say a good probably 25 or 30 feet down a very steep rocky path down to the surface of the water. There are places within a few hundred yards in either direction where you could park a car and hop down to a sandy beach area. So even if you were drunk off your butt and decided to go on a kind of bizarre excursion into the water at sometime between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning, there are easier ways to do it. On top of that, Keith and Cassandra, Sandy, are on a first date. He had just was taking a break from his longtime girlfriend and had asked out Sandy, to movies and this party. They're on a first date. She's a very strikingly attractive young woman, but is considered modest and not wild by her sisters, she's very close with. They said they could not see Sandy getting naked on a first date with this, cute guy that she'd met in class who had just broken up with his girlfriend. And then by all accounts, people that were at the party that night at this Christopher Newport University, there was an apartment complex there, at this keg party, they reported that Sandy and Keith didn't seem to be spending a lot of time together. There didn't seem to be a lot of, much of a click between the two of them. She spent the evening talking to her former boyfriend at the party, and he spent a good portion of the evening kind of crying on the shoulder to another mutual friend about his recent breakup with his girlfriend. So, they left the party sometime around 1 or 1:30 in the morning to get her home. I think off the top of my head, I think it was a 2 a.m. curfew. And then oddly, the Colonial Parkway murders, or rather the Colonial Parkway itself, is not on the way home to her parents' home where she lives in Grafton, Virginia. It's out of the way. So it's further odd that Keith's car ends up on the Colonial Parkway, a place he didn't particularly like because it was very dark and spooky at night, and a place where Sandy's sisters say that she probably would have refused to go. So there's a good chance that Keith's car is found on the Colonial Parkway, but that perhaps Keith and Cassandra never made it as far as the Colonial Parkway. And it is very odd that the Parkway isn't even on the way home between Christopher Newport University and Grafton, which is where he's supposed to get her back by 2 o'clock, his commitment to her parents. So in this third example now, we have 2 people disappear, so we don't know. Now, they've never shown up, and I think it's pretty safe to say that they're dead, but we don't know how they died. So then you move forward again. Now we're back to September. So 3 of the 4 double homicides occur in the same 6-week back-to-school time frame. The 4th couple go missing over Labor Day weekend. Their names are Anna Maria Phelps, who's 18, and Daniel Lauer, who's 21. They disappear while driving from Amelia County, Virginia, down I-64 en route to Virginia Beach. And they're not a couple either. Anna Maria had been dating Daniel Lauer's brother, Clinton, he goes by Clint. So they were essentially traveling companions. And they go missing along I-64, which is more of a major highway. And Daniel's car, which is a gold 1972 Chevy Nova, kind of a beater, but, you know, functioning fine, is found abandoned along I-64 in a place called New Kent County, which is pretty rural, at a rest stop on the wrong side of the road. There are 2 rest stops on I-64. They're kind of on either side of this divided highway. And most people know it now as the Virginia Welcome Center. And there's a very distinctive Love, L-O-V-E, sculpture there that a lot of people know. The car is found on the wrong side of the highway. In other words, they're driving from Amelia County down to Virginia Beach, where they had moved. The car is found on the opposite side of the road, heading back as if you were driving back from Virginia Beach up towards Amelia County, up towards Richmond that way. So the car is facing in the wrong direction, and they're nowhere to be found. The car has items that were clothing and other items that they had in the back seat that they were using, you know, to move down to Virginia Beach. They were bringing some more items with them, personal effects and that kind of stuff, you know, in garbage bags. But they're nowhere to be found. The car is very odd. It's parked on the truck acceleration ramp of the rest stop, as far away as you could get from the buildings that would, you know, be the rest stop where the restrooms and vending machines and that kind of thing were. There's no video surveillance back then. Again, this wasn't an era where there was a lot of video surveillance, as we see more of that kind of thing now. But it appears that the car was parked in a way to be as far away from the buildings as possible. And then there's this odd detail there where a roach clip with feathers on it, it was the 80s, is very prominently placed in the window of the car. And law enforcement takes it as a taunt. It's kind of a very in-your-face thing. It's placed in a way that it's designed to be actually in your face as you walk up to the car. So no Anna, no Daniel. It's not until 6 weeks later that their bodies are found in a wooded area. It's about a mile away as the crow flies. It's hunters, turkey hunters are hunting in a preserve that's shared by a group of hunters. It's a private place, privately owned, about a mile away, and it would be one exit further towards Virginia Beach, so original direction of travel, but off the road and down a logging road. So you go to one exit further south of the, I guess you'd put southeast of the rest stop, pull off, drive over the highway, and then you'd have to know where you were going. This isn't a place you would just stumble upon. Down an old logging road, and then the bodies are found side by side under a blanket, which was taken from Daniel's car. And unfortunately, it had been very, very wet, and the bodies had been messed with by wild animals and that sort of thing. The bodies were in terrible shape. It was actually very difficult to determine cause of death. Ultimately, the bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and the Institute people, in analyzing them, found nick marks on the bones. So they feel that it's likely that they were stabbed. But cause of death was indeterminate. And now, this fourth case, we're back with the Virginia State Police, because New Kent County is very rural, and at that time doesn't even have a police force. So they didn't even have a sheriff back then. So the Virginia State Police take over the case. So now we have 2 FBI cases and 2 Virginia State Police cases. And then to further complicate things, the 2 Virginia State Police cases are handled by separate Virginia State Police offices. So it's only, when we get to the third couple, the disappearance, Keith and Cassandra, that they begin to realize they've got a problem with people missing and murdered. And then, of course, by the time we get to the fourth case, they recognize that they may be dealing with a serial killer or killers who are preying on couples. And again, I use that term loosely. They're not really couples, traveling companions, what have you, but people in cars along this tidewater corridor along the Colonial Parkway and I-64. And then at that point, the murders appear to stop. There are other murders that take place individuals that could be potentially related. Interestingly, we asked the FBI at a meeting in 2010, and we received a direct answer to the question. We asked them if there's anything in the forensics that links the 4 Colonial Parkway murders. And at that point, they were going back and re-examining the case after the families put pressure on them. The FBI had lost control of 78 highly graphic crime scene photos, which had leaked out to the public, and the families were very upset about this, obviously. Mm-hmm. And we had called out the FBI publicly about this, and they actually did react. And I'll be honest, I quarterbacked that strategy to pressure the FBI. And they did put resources back into the case, but we asked them, is there anything in the forensics that links these 4 double homicides? And at that time, the answer was no. The circumstances are there. It's couples, cars, isolated rural locations, rest stops, lovers, potentially lovers lane situations, no robbery, no sexual assault based on what we know. Remember, we don't have bodies, and sometimes the bodies aren't in great shape. Limited sign of struggle. All of these places are places that someone might stop to engage in sexual activity, or perhaps to make a low-level drug deal, or what have you. I want to be clear here. I'm not criticizing any of the victims. I feel like the 8 victims in the Colonial Parkway murders, as near as I can tell, were just young people doing young people things. I don't think they were doing anything, horribly inappropriate. it is possible, even though we say that they're not couples, it's possible that some of them were engaged in sexual behavior of some sort, and might have been surprised or approached. And it's certainly possible that they were approached by someone that they saw as non-threatening, like we talked about a few minutes ago, Bill, the authority figure theory.
Yeah, I mean, especially since these are couples, and they're basically whomever is doing this is able to control them. So if it's one individual guy, then you got to assume that he's using a gun or something. But none of these people were shot either, were they? I mean,
well, no. It's funny. The first couple, Cathy and Becky, are strangled, throats cut, diesel fuel used. Second couple, David and Robin from Ragged Island, they're shot to death.
This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp Online Therapy. People don't always realize that physical symptoms like headaches, teeth grinding, and even digestive issues can be indicators of stress. And let's not forget about the doom scrolling, sleeping too little, sleeping too much, undereating, or overeating. I like to think that I deal with my stresses by taking a little bit of mindfulness each day. And I do try to make it a point to focus on myself, because stress shows up in all kinds of ways. And in a world that's telling you to do more, sleep less, and grind all the time, here's your reminder to take care of yourself, do less, and maybe try some therapy. I've personally been in therapy since I was a child, and I would suggest it for everyone. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's so much more affordable than in-person therapy. Give it a try and see if online therapy can help lower your stress. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and Who Killed Amy Mahalovic listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/who. That's BetterHelp.com/who.
Third couple, Sandy, and Keith, they go missing. We don't have any bodies. We don't know how they died. Fourth couple, Anna Maria and Daniel, they disappear along I-64. Bodies are found 6 weeks later in very tough shape. It appears that a knife was used. So the method of killing varies quite a bit. It is possible that if this is one perpetrator or even two, they might have used a gun to establish control and then switched over to the knife or other method of killing.
Yeah, I mean, you just got to figure that there's some way that he's controlling the scene, because, again, he's also approaching them in circumstances that their guard is down, too.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about the parking thing, that's entirely possible. If, for instance, let's just say people are pulled over and they're listening to music or making out or maybe smoking a joint or
whatever,
all three, I don't know, up on them, and then is sort of a blitz attack, and they're suddenly at the car door, or they approach as if they're law enforcement, and I'm not saying they are law enforcement. They might just have a light on the dashboard or what have you. And I can picture myself as a younger man in situations like that. That happened to me once or twice, where you're spending time with your significant other. I was there with a girlfriend. It happened more than once, and before you know it, there's a rap on the window, and a cop is telling you to button it up and move on. And, you're kind of embarrassed, and, you're like, oh, okay, So luckily in the situation I just described, it was a legitimate officer who didn't mean us any harm, but just wanted us to move it along. Right. But it happened a couple of times, and it happened to lots of friends of mine.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a common thing, especially, when you don't have any other place to go as a teenager or a
Sure.
college student. I mean, why wouldn't you go? I mean, we have
Well, and
in Cleveland, we have the Metro Parks, which are basically green space it's huge green space, but it's absolutely where one would go for that type of thing. So
absolutely, and people know that.
Yeah. I mean, if you're driving
And
through,
these places are that.
and I guess if you're parked, I mean, you could just pull up right behind somebody and you're in control right then and there because they can't move. Were they ever,
Yeah.
did they ever get tire tracks or anything like that?
They did look at those things, and they were the elements complicate things. There was rain, and I remember they were looking at the muddy tire prints in Cathy and Becky's example. And in several of these examples, it's days or weeks before the bodies are found. So that's a further complicating factor. And
True.
Water enters into probably 3 of the 4. It's only the 4th example where they're found on the land away from the water. That's Anna Maria and Daniel, who were found off this old logging road. The others are all on the York and James rivers. And it's possible, for example, in the 3rd example, Keith and Cassandra, who go missing, that perhaps their bodies ended up in the water of the James River. And the James and York River are deep and powerful. There are United States Navy ships sailing up and down the York River. There's a nearby facility where explosives, including nuclear weapons, are loaded onto U.S. Navy ships within sight of these pull-offs along the Parkway. My point is the rivers are very deep and wide at that point with a strong current. And so it's big enough to sail a massive United States Navy ship up the middle of that river. So these are not, some small little tributary. These are big rivers flowing out towards the Atlantic.
And a lot
so
of
it's possible, for example, that Keith and Cassandra, if they were murdered somehow, that their bodies were placed in the water and that they might never be found. This does happen.
Yeah, especially, I mean, again, with that particular type of river where there's such a constant flow, I mean, it wouldn't have taken long for them to get caught in that. And then eventually the chances of them being found after just a day or two would have been slim and none. I mean, that's at least my...
Sure. I mean, again, law enforcement dragged the river and looked for the bodies and for evidence, but, they were unsuccessful. But one of the things I asked the FBI at a meeting a couple of years ago was, about the relationships. And one of the things they said was, what are the chances, though, that 4 double homicides are going to happen under similar circumstances in a relatively short 3-year period in a relatively compact area? If you use the Colonial Parkway murders site where Cathy and Becky's car was found and then where Keith and Cassandra's car was found a couple of miles away, if you use that as the center point, it's about a half hour at night in either direction to the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, where David Nobling and Robin Edwards' bodies were found, or about a half hour in the other direction to where Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer's bodies were found. But if you use that center point, it's still in a relatively compact area. And they said, as they said to me at that time, couples homicides are rare, Lover's Lane homicides are rare, and they said, we just think it's extremely unlikely that several, if not all, of these murders are related. Now there are individual suspects for some of the murders. And, there are people that have relationships or former relationships with, one or more of the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So it is possible that, as I've said, one of these murders, when solved, could fall off the table and not be related to the other Colonial Parkway murders. The term Colonial Parkway Murders is a media creation. Local newspapers and radio and television began calling these murders the Colonial Parkway Murders. But even at its most basic, only two of the cases even happened on the Colonial Parkway.
It's just so weird that they would, but I mean, it's sort of one of those, like, it's easy for people to latch onto that name. And I mean, if they're going to give it,
and actually that was probably okay, because, it is helpful to have a handle, if you will, because we did feel that, we needed to put some pressure on law enforcement to put resources into the case. And at least we had, a name. It's funny, we've actually pushed back on something. Some people refer to this case as the CPK case. This is online, the Colonial Parkway killer case. And we feel very strongly, we don't think that we should be focusing on killers here. We think we should be focusing on victims. Now, we may be the family members of 8 murder victims, and so we have a strong feeling about this, but Colonial Parkway Murders is something that local media created, but when the families at different times have referenced the case, we've always tried to refer to it as the Colonial Parkway Murders to make it clear to people what it is we're talking about. And we've worked together, I think, pretty effectively to try to put pressure on FBI and Virginia State Police to keep working these cases and trying to tell us, who killed our loved ones.
Yeah. And do you have any, after being embedded with this for 32 years and much more so in the last decade, do you feel like you have an idea of who this person possibly could be, or are you just as much in the same field as the authorities, and you're still waiting for that, piece of DNA to be tested, and or do you feel like you have an idea, or
the FBI and Virginia State Police have put forward different theories, and there are competing, theories on who this might be. I personally, my personal pendulum has swung back and forth several times between these 4 double homicides are all related to some or all of these murders are not related. These days, I kind of find myself back in a mix. Sometimes I use this analogy. When we were kids, we used to study in math class, and they would use something called an overhead projector. This sounds like it's ancient history now.
I remember this.
Well, for the benefit of your younger listeners, it threw a white shadow up on the wall, and the math teacher could write things on this clear plastic sheet, which would then throw them up on the wall for all to see. This is, again, before video monitors and all that stuff. And sometimes in math class, we'd be sorting out like and not like things, triangles or circles, or it didn't matter what it was, but you were trying to group things. And so you might be sorting them by color or shape or size or mathematical value or whatever it was. But one of the things that makes me think about the Colonial Parkway Murders is I think the Colonial Parkway Murders, there are patterns here. They're just not immediately apparent. In other words, I'm not sure it's a straight up 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of relationship. And there are these other murders that took place around the same time that are somewhat similar, but they're of individuals and not couples. But I think there are patterns, but I think we may end up like that overhead projector where you've got overlapping circles. I think there's something there. I don't think they're all unrelated, but I don't know that it's such a straight linear sequence of events. There's a 5th murder of another couple, another lesbian couple.
I was going to ask you about that one.
In 1996, so this is fully 10 years after Cathy and Becky are killed,
Right.
and 180 miles away, so it's in a whole nother part of Virginia, up in the Shenandoah National Park. But note the fact that it's a national park. Two young women, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans, are murdered over Memorial Day, 1996. So it's 10 years after Cathy and Becky are murdered, but they're murdered in a very similar fashion. And the FBI even said in interviews, which they don't do a lot of, that they were looking at substantial similarities between the murder of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski and Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. As a matter of fact, I met recently with a reporter named Kate Miles, who's working on a book on the Julie Williams, Lolly Winans murder, to compare notes. We've talked numerous times and met at our house up here in Connecticut to compare her research and mine on the cases to see whether they overlap. And there are a lot of really strange overlapping aspects, particularly to Cathy and Becky's murder and Julie and Lolly's murder. You've got, lesbian, outdoorsy, athletic women killed in a national park on a 3-day holiday weekend using very similar techniques. I don't think we have to get too graphic this time around, but, using knives but interestingly, that's also an FBI case, because if you have the misfortune to be killed in a national park, your murder investigation is handled by the National Park Service Police and the FBI. They have jurisdiction. It's a different FBI office. Here we go again.
Yep.
It's the Richmond FBI office, but they have a theory and a suspect, but they've been unable to prove that their leading suspect is, beyond a reasonable doubt, I think it's the court standard, is the responsible party. But that murder is strikingly similar to Cathy and Becky's murder. I'm not saying it's related. I don't know. But like I said, that whole math class thing, I think there were relationships here, but when you start grouping the murders, I think there's overlap, but I don't think it might necessarily be quite so straightforward as these. Here are a sequence of murders, and this is how they took place. It is quite possible that any one of the Colonial Parkway murders might have been committed by someone else, and it's just coincidental to the time frame of the other murders.
So you're not 100% convinced that they're all connected, but you do think some of them are connected.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am these days.
And that's kind of a fluid thing.
And it's funny, we continue to receive tips. I received a tip last night from a woman. I've tried to make myself very easy to find.
Mm-hmm.
With as I mentioned to you, I have kept the same email address and cell phone number since my first cell phone and first email address. I've had other work and other email addresses, but I kept my contact information the same for all these years to make myself easy to find. You have to get around the fact that Bill Thomas is a pretty common name, but I try to make myself easy to find. For years when I lived in Los Angeles, when I commented on internet sites, newspaper, radio, TV, I would sign, Bill Thomas, brother of Cathy Thomas, Colonial Parkway Murders, Los Angeles, California. I would sometimes even put my email address in there. I've tried to make myself and the families easy to find, but as recently as last night, a woman was messaging me on Facebook, asking me if I'd ever heard about a particular suspect, and it was all new to me. So what I try to do is gather that information and then provide that to the FBI. I don't pretend to be an investigator, but given how long this case is dragged on for, I try to insist that people talk to the families first. And law enforcement doesn't like this, and I don't care. When you have a case that's dragged on this long, On some level, we're going to handle things our way. But then I do try to put some notes together and turn it over to law enforcement, the FBI specifically, and they can follow up as they see fit. But, people continue to come forward. We just crossed over 7,000 likes and 7,500 followers on our Facebook group. We talk about the case and other related topics on a Facebook page we call Colonial Parkway Murders. I'm working on a book now on the case. We are shooting a television show this fall, which will be on the Oxygen Network next spring, which will be all about the Colonial Parkway Murders. And I'm thinking about maybe doing a podcast.
You'd be a welcomed addition. And so with all this stuff that you're doing, and in the last 10 years, you've obviously become a bigger part of the investigation and keeping the pressure on. I mean, is doing these interviews and doing these television shows, other than the obviously solving the case, but you said before you're not an investigator, so at the end of the day, the end goal is to keep the case in the spotlight?
Yeah, I see myself as an advocate. I'm the brother of a murder victim. My sister Cathy was a wonderful, amazing person, an incredible pioneer, and just the best my family had to offer. And I think
what's your
myself
favorite
and my
memory
two
of
brothers. Oh my gosh, there's so many. One of the things that's been great about this case, actually, and there are good things, is a couple of years ago, the FBI asked me to reach out to Cathy's classmates from the Naval Academy to talk to them about some issues that had come up in the investigation. And they asked me to go back. And so I was tracking down Cathy's classmates from the Naval Academy. And, these are amazing women. And remember, this was in the second class with women at the Naval Academy at a time when women were completely unwelcomed at the service academies. But one of the great things that came out of it was, in addition to talking to these amazing women who've gone on to do great things in the Navy and Marines and elsewhere, was tracking down, these friends. They also told me stories, things that I'd never heard before. In other words, when Cathy went away to Annapolis to go to the Naval Academy, she was following in the footsteps of my dad, Joe Thomas, who's class of 53, my older brother, Richard, who's class of 75. So he's 6 years older than Cathy. And then Cathy's in the class of 81. But we obviously weren't there when she was there. So she would tell us stories when we'd see her on weekends and when she was on leave and that sort of thing. But when I tracked down these friends, I heard lots of extra stories and really just fun memories. And so, the Navy did not make these young women feel welcome at all. And the upperclassmen who actually really run the Naval Academy
right,
were particularly horrible to these young women who were entering the service academies for the first time. The previous class of the last class of where it was single sex is a class of 79. It's not lost on any of us that their Latin motto, each year the classes at Annapolis choose a Latin motto. Their Latin motto was all male. And they, these guys were unbelievable jerks and were absolutely horrible. And I'd say that to any of them. They were absolutely horrible to these young women, made them feel incredibly unwelcome. And actually, there were people at Annapolis, including officers, who actually tried to drive these women out of the service. And I won't dance on that. Remember, I come from a Navy family.
Mm-hmm.
But, Cathy was one of those people that helped keep other people's spirits up during a really difficult and dark period in the Navy and Marine Corps history. And so the stories that make me smile and laugh were, Cathy, had this expression, "Suck it up, Buttercup," which she would say to other women at the academy when they were under this horrific pressure, to just, to stick together. And they actually tried, the class of 81 tried to prevent more women from being pushed out and dropping out. They actually set a goal, which they did not achieve, of having 81 women graduate in the class of 81. But those stories about, the things that Cathy did and said to help her friends, women and men, get through a very challenging environment at the United States Naval Academy make me very proud.
Thank you again so much for listening to this week's episode, The Colonial Parkway Murders, Part 2. If you have not subscribed yet to Who Killed Amy Mihaljevic, please do. And as a reminder, this is an independently produced podcast. So if you'd like to help keep the lights on and the recorders running, you can support the show by clicking the donate button on the right side of whokilledamymihaljevic.com or via the Venmo app with my username @BillHuffman3. Any amount is appreciated, as it does, as I mentioned before, keep the recorders running. If you want to stay up to date on the case, you can follow me on Twitter @BillHuffman3. So anyone with information can call their local FBI branch or email it to colonial_parkway_murders @ic.fbi.gov. I will put that on the show notes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. That will help support the show and help keep the causes that I do support in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Holly's murder is asked to email or call the Hampton County State Police Detective Unit at 413-505-5993. I will also provide the email in the show notes. People are also welcome to text any information to crimes, which is 274-637, with the subject line, Solve Holly Peranian. A $40,000 reward is being offered for information leading directly to the arrest and conviction of the person or persons responsible. If you have any information regarding the case of 16-year-old Molly Ann Bish, you can call the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Massachusetts State Police is also looking for information, and they can be reached at 1-800-808-9677. Don't forget, October 27th will mark 30 years Amy Mihaljevic's case has remained unsolved. So anybody with any information, please contact the Bay Village Police Department at 440-871-1234. The FBI is offering a reward up to $25,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the individuals responsible for the death of Amy Renee Mihaljevic. Stay tuned for Part 3 of the Colonial Parkway Murders next Friday. Thank you again so much for listening, and in the meantime, be safe.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle, who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello presents Blind Rage. It's a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.
Hi,
Hi, I'm Sean McCabe.
And I'm Carrie McCabe.
We are, well, married, obviously, but we're also obsessed with the darker side of things.
True crime stories, alien abductions, poltergeists. If it leaves you scratching your head and keeping those lights on at night, we want to hear about it.
That's why we host the podcast, Ain't It Scary, with Sean and Carrie.
Every week, we bring our listeners a true story guaranteed to send chills down your spine. From history's most brutal serial killers to the mystery of spontaneous human combustion.
Yep, lots of these stories leave unanswered questions behind, and you'll get to poke through the rubble of the evidence with a hardened skeptic and
someone whose mind is more open to fun.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
You can find Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie wherever you get your podcasts, and on social media at Ain't It Scary. Come play with us.